Hey everyone, this is Brian from the Tennis IQ podcast. Josh and I hope that you are enjoying the content and discussions that we put out week after week. If you'd like to support the podcast and help us to continue to produce quality episodes, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Currently, we have 3 tiers of support: the fan level at $3 per month, the supporter level at $7 per month, and the champion level at $20 per month. Benefits of joining the Tennis IQ podcast community include episode transcripts, participation in book club discussions, and access to monthly masterclasses with me and Josh. For more on these benefits of support, head on over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Thank you so much. And now, on to the show. Hello and welcome to the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Brian Lomax.
And I'm Josh Berger. For today's episode, we are going to discuss the 2023 U.S. Open. And I think we'll definitely talk about the both the champions and the finalists. On the women's side, Coco Gauff beat Aryna Sabalenka. And on the men's side, Novak Djokovic defeated Daniil Medvedev. So we'll definitely talk about both the champions and the runners-up on both sides. And I think there's also some other players that I know we want to at least talk about a little bit in terms of both their performance, but also, bring in some quotes in terms of their perspective on some of the matches and always with the goal to try to tie in what we saw and what different players were sharing with the mental game and bring up different perspectives related to that. So I think a nice place to start would be to look at Sabalenka. She, I think it was very interesting that when Iga Swiatek lost earlier in the tournament, it was clear that regardless of Sabalenka's end result, that she was going to become number one. So I think that's always an interesting dynamic, and that created an interesting dynamic where she knew going into that final against Coco that either way she was going to become number one. So I think that is maybe one starting point. I mean, I think it was an interesting final, and definitely curious to hear what you thought, Brian, where, Sabalenka came out really hot, played really well that first set, and then things started to slip away. And I think, and I know we were talking about this a little bit beforehand, but I think her semifinal match against Madison Keys could have had something to do with it in terms of, her body language, her attitude in portions of that semifinal match, especially the beginning of it, where she lost that first set 6-love. She was down a break. I think it was actually like 5-4, where Keys was serving for it. In the second set, where, she wasn't at her best, was definitely down on herself, managed to win, but couldn't quite manage to turn things around in that same sort of way, especially with the crowd against her and with Coco playing, unbelievably in certain parts of that match. But yeah, what were some of your thoughts about Sabalenka's performance?
Well, I think your note about the number one is very good. In fact, going into the Madison Keys match, she knew she was going to be number one because she was actually introduced by the person who introduces the players to the crowd as the new number one come Monday. So I thought that was a pretty interesting way to introduce her, especially since they don't tell where she's from because of the war with Russia and Ukraine. So that's how they chose to introduce her to the crowd. And yeah, in that match against Keys, she started pretty poorly, and you were able to read it in her body language very clearly. And it was just a little bit striking that the body language would be that negative that fast. And just a lot of gesturing toward the box, etc. And I'll be honest, I gave up on the match after the first set and really the first 3 games. and so when I woke up the next day and I saw the score, I was really, really surprised that she was able to pull it out. Now, they give her credit because she is a great fighter, no doubt about that. And that she was able to sort of fight through whatever demons that she was experiencing against Keys. But that was, I think, always going to be a tougher task against Coco. Madison Keys, while she's a great ball striker, you can also make a lot of errors in matches. She'd been on a hot streak, obviously, in this tournament, and she's been a Grand Slam finalist in the past. So she's a great player, but also subject to streaks at times. And so, maybe Sabalenka knows that. Maybe it's a little bit easier to hang in there. But then, yeah, as you said, Josh, Sabalenka came out, played a great first set against Gauff, but then things began to change and Gauff started to gain some momentum. And then, of course, the crowd was so into it that it was going to be really hard for Sabalenka to turn that around. And I think the body language, again, kind of got the best of her a bit in that third. I think it becomes really hard once you're down a break to have negative body language and to really crawl back. Sometimes there's this notion of some negativity can help bring us to be more intense and more focused, but that's not a guarantee. Sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. And if you notice that you're getting negative and you continue to play poorly, or the other person plays really well, as I think Gauff did, to me this is a match that Coco won, not that Sabalenka lost, and so it's hard to get back there. So it'd be interesting to know, Josh, your first point, how much did the number one thing did it make a difference? Was it on her mind? Was she a little bit more emotional because of that, or were there some other factors going on there?
It's tough to know. I mean, I know that, looking at her post-match press conference, she was talking about the number one ranking, but sort of in a different way.
Yeah.
Where sort of from a motivation standpoint, and I think this is something actually we could talk about with some of the other players, whether it be Coco, whether it be Djokovic as well, because they all touched on sort of motivation in their own way. And I think it actually can be a sort of a theme here. But she talked about how, the number one ranking is important to her, but that she cares about sort of, what happens these next few months in terms of finishing the year at that point. So there's a quote that she had from that post-match interview where she said, but for me, it's more about ending the year as world number one, not just becoming world number one and then the next week you're second. It's good so that I can say I've been number one, but I really would like to finish the year as world number one. That's why I'm still positive and I'm still motivated. So I thought that was interesting that, it sounds like maybe she wasn't feeling as devastated or as upset after the match, because at least she knew that, she was about to become world number one, and that was exciting for her. But I think it's tough to know how that impacted things. And, I think sometimes people can have certain things in the back of their mind, like a ranking, like maybe a rating, not that they're using it as an excuse, but in a certain way, it's almost like a mechanism where rather than feeling like they maybe need to risk it or put something out, put everything out there, they're like, okay, no, I'll be fine, even if I lose this match. So again, that's just, really a guess, but I think yeah, it really was a clear shift after that first set, where she really was dominant in that first set against Coco. Coco, didn't seem to be at her best. And then in that second set, and it was a battle, certainly. It seemed like that's where things started to shift. And maybe that's where Sabalenka lost some of that self-belief. Maybe that's where, she felt like she was battling more than just Coco. Maybe it was the crowd, and everyone was obviously very excited for Coco and for the possibility of things starting to turn around. But yeah, and then in that third set, when, in reality, it really is one set all, it just sort of felt from the start that it was Coco's set to lose. And yes, maybe the crowd again had something to do with that, but I think Sabalenka seemed defeated. And I think, maybe there is some sort of acceptance where it's like, okay, no matter what, I'm going to be number one on Monday. Or maybe that didn't have anything to do with it, but she, from a body language standpoint, from an attitude standpoint, it was almost like every point she lost, she was almost like laughing, or like, almost like that sarcastic sort of thing that Medvedev does at times, where it's like, oh, here we go again, that sort of thing, and almost like that acceptance of the defeat before it even happened.
Yeah, and another player who talked about the numbers was Swiatek, and that perhaps the number one ranking was too present in her mind because she, if she lost to Ostapenko as she did, she was going to lose that ranking, and she mentioned how she still needs to be more like Roger, Novak, Rafa, in terms of how to continue to focus on the tournament itself and not the rankings. And she mentioned that she's a player who likes numbers, and so maybe this is also similar a little bit to Alcaraz's mention of maturity, but maybe this is also a maturity moment for Iga to learn to put some of that stuff aside. Which obviously is hard because I think now more than ever, people talk about rankings and Grand Slam titles and all these achievements more than ever before in the past. I think, I'm dating myself here, but when I was a kid, nobody really talked about number of Grand Slams. Like, you knew that Roy Emerson had 12, but it wasn't like as big of a deal, it seemed. And even, back then, you didn't have computer rankings coming out every Monday.
That's interesting.
Right? These things were compiled in a slightly different way.
And not everyone would go to Australia.
Exactly. Yeah, not till it changed to a hardcore tournament. So the spotlight, I think, on these things has grown and grown and grown, and therefore it also tends to grow more and more in the minds of players. And it's the same with other aspects of tennis with ratings, whether that's UTR or WTN. These things are now much more present, much more dynamic. And it's a lot more for players to deal with now than in the past. So that doesn't, that includes professional players. And so there's a lot, and they're asked about it a lot. You listen in these press conferences and they're asked about these things. And so learning to, kind of manage all that in your own mind and manage that in your own team, I think is an important piece. And I'm sure Sabalenka will learn from it. I think it's great that, right after the match, she continued to give herself something to play for. And that's a real positive. So she'll be motivated, hopefully not only for the rest of the year, but all right, let's say she does finish the year number one. Let's do it again. Or whatever that is. Let me continue to explore how good I can be, because she's a very good player. She's made a lot of strides these last couple of years in terms of serve and her consistency and so forth. But everybody, there are always new levels of performance. And for her, I think it's exciting to see where she can go with her game.
Absolutely. And yeah, she's had a fantastic year, which is why she's now number one. Between Australia, she's had a lot of great wins. She's, I think, in many ways sort of put it all together this year.
Yeah, she's made the semifinals at all four,
Exactly, which is no small feat. I mean, that's a certain level of consistency of performance that, I think most players most players, or just about everybody, can really admire. So no, I think she's in many ways put it together. I think she's also had quotes about sort of this year sort of taking responsibility for her own tennis game, not feeling like she and I know she's had people around her maybe telling her some of the right things, and maybe she wasn't listening. But I think she's gotten to a point where she's ready to maybe do it for herself, or just take responsibility. And I think there's always setbacks, there's always ups and downs. It's never a straight line from progress never goes in a completely straight line from where we are right now to where we want to be. It's never I'm improving this percentage each day or each week. And there's always, ups and downs. We can think of it sort of like the stock market or something like that, where there's, on a certain day it's up and on a certain day it's down, and there's plenty of emotion. But, we can look at the year that she's had, which is remarkable, which is why she's now number one. So she's certainly earned that. And I agree that it's important and impressive that she seems to have a lot of motivation for these next couple of months, in terms of really trying to finish the year on a strong note, trying to not just reach number one, which she has already now, but finish the year at number one. And I think it's always important, whether it's her, and I think we'll talk more about Djokovic, and sort of being able to sustain his motivation at his age and everything that he's accomplished. But I think it's really important, especially as somebody accomplishes great things, whether that's becoming number one, whether that's winning many titles as Djokovic has, that they continue to find new reasons to motivate themselves. Because I know something we've talked about a lot on this podcast is if we set our goals just based on outcomes. If we set our goal where it's okay, this is all for this tournament, it's all for the US Open, I'm trying to win the US Open, or I'm trying to become world number one, or I'm trying to run a marathon, or whatever it is. After we do it, what's left? How do we stay motivated? How do we what do we still have left? And I think we've talked about the book Atomic Habits by James Clear, and he talks about this same idea, where it's like instead of setting a goal based on one singular thing, whether that's an outcome like a ranking or a rating or a tournament, can we start with the identity piece, where it's like, hey, my identity is to be a tennis player, but really to try to my identity, my goal, or to try to become the best player that I can possibly be. And that doesn't finish when you reach number one. That's okay. How can I keep that going? How can I keep finding that new level of performance that I'm after? And I think for her, it's very clear that over these next couple months, she wants to hold on to that ranking. So I really like that quote.
Yeah, for sure. A good book that also can help people explore that difference between setting goals as like winning things or rankings versus what James Clear is referring to is a book called Mastery by George Leonard, written in the 90s. And it really helps people to understand that there are always new levels of performance, and that the journey really never ends, that these milestones really, or that's what a ranking is, a tournament is, they're simply milestones on that road to mastery, and that road is a never-ending one. And the more players can look at it that way, and I think that's what we've seen from the great players, is that they understand that this is about them exploring their skills and their talent and seeing where it can take them. Obviously, with a sport like tennis, age and your physical condition will at some point play a bigger factor than it does earlier on, and then things may drop off there, right? But yeah, if you can explore it as long as you can, that's I think a good goal. How about we talk about a little bit on the men's side, Josh? Maybe some stuff on Alcaraz and Medvedev.
Absolutely. And yeah, we can talk about them and sort of save Coco and Djokovic till a little bit later, and then give them their fair due, and talk more about them and their performances. But yeah, no, I think with both Alcaraz and Medvedev, and they had quite a match against each other. I think there's a lot to talk about. I think first with Alcaraz, I think he had a lot of expectations going into this tournament. I mean, after that absolutely epic 5-set win against Djokovic at Wimbledon.
And the Cincinnati match too, right? I mean, that was a great match, even though he lost that one, but it was a great match.
Absolutely. I mean, maybe, certainly one of the best, if not the best Masters finals in history, really. I mean, just in terms of the competitiveness, in terms of some of those points, in terms of, the stakes of number one and number two battling it out the way that they were. But yeah, I think with everything going on with him being number one, with Wimbledon, with that Cincinnati match, I think there was a lot of expectations on him. And there's a lot of talk about having having that rematch, that Alcaraz Djokovic rematch at in the final. And it was also interesting from a ranking standpoint here, where he knew, I think Djokovic just had to win his first round match. I think that's what it was. Or maybe even just
he had no points to defend, right? Because he didn't play.
Yeah, he didn't have points from last year. Alcaraz had won the tournament last year, so he had 2,000 points to defend. And so, as the tournament progressed, it was clear that Alcaraz was going to become number two after the tournament. So I think that could have been a factor as well. But I think there was a lot of expectations more than anything going into it. And I think with that match against Medvedev, Alcaraz had beaten Medvedev pretty comfortably the two times before that they had played. The two more recent times that they'd played. Medvedev beat him, I think, in 2021 before Alcaraz's big rise. But earlier this year, Alcaraz beat Medvedev twice, both at Wimbledon, and I think the other was at Indian Wells. Yeah, and both times in straight sets. And it didn't have a set closer than 6-3, I believe. So, pretty comfortable win both times. So I think there was, a lot of expectations that Alcaraz would win that match, and maybe even, in a relatively comfortable way, even though Medvedev, has won the US Open just a couple of years ago, had been playing quite well. So I think Alcaraz, maybe had certain expectations that he'd win that semifinal match, and that and also about the potential final. And yeah, I think he, in certain ways, didn't manage to bring out his best stuff, especially in portions of that semifinal. I think that that first set was very close, and then that second set, his level definitely dropped off. His consistency, took a dip, and yes, he fought back in that third set, definitely, and the fourth set was competitive, but I think he almost seemed to run out of options. I think his consistency took a turn for the worse. And again, this is while Medvedev is playing just incredible defense, getting everything back, while also attacking and hitting winners. So, it was tough. And I think we can talk a little bit about his quote from after that match. I know you mentioned it before we started, Brian. But yeah, I think he was clearly getting pretty frustrated with himself at certain points throughout that match. So I think it's also interesting to think about the impact that potentially had.
And, Medvedev mentioned before playing that he needed to be at his absolute best in 11 out of 10. And then I think he gave himself a grade of 12
out
of 10.
Did.
Right. So when Medvedev is playing his best, he's very difficult to play because his defense is excellent. He's good off of both sides. And, he did a good job of, I think, keeping Alcaraz off balance. And like you said, Alcaraz was maybe not quite on his game for whatever reason, like he had been in some past matches. He made a lot of mistakes, especially, I thought, on the backhand. We saw more drop shot mistakes, or drop shots that were not as good in this match, which might indicate some level of tension for various reasons. So I thought, I was actually surprised in his press conference that he brought this up, but I think obviously he thinks it's valid, that he wasn't maybe yet mature enough to handle some of this, and that he needs more experience, and that he needs to talk to his team and Juan Carlos Ferrero about these things. And that's a good bit of self-awareness on his part. to realize that more experience and more maturity as a player and in the game is necessary to win these kinds of matches. And so, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And I think it was great to see Medvedev play so well, to play that 12 out of 10. He knew that he was going to have to do that again against Djokovic. And I'm not, that's a tougher thing to do, especially with the way Novak has been playing. And I think Novak learned a little bit from the last time that they played a U.S. Open final. So I thought Medvedev didn't quite reach that level. The second set was obviously very good, but I think there were some things that prevented Daniil from executing as well in that final.
Absolutely, and I think for starting with the semifinal, he really managed to play at a high level, and I think it seemed like emotionally he was also seemed pretty sort of emotionally stable throughout that semifinal as well. And I think he's the type of person that certainly has ups and downs, and sometimes going at it with the crowd or the umpire, or the other player if he's playing Sissipas. But it seemed in that semifinal he was more so just sticking with the tennis. And yes, I think he recognized that people were rooting for Alcaraz, especially once Medvedev was winning, and the crowd wanted to sort of see, extend the match. But so I think, at certain points he was sort of trying to pump up the crowd and sort of using his hand to sort of try to increase the cheering, maybe after he won some points. But he wasn't doing some of the antics that he has done in the past. And I think in a certain way, I think it could have connected to maybe an increased level of focus, where maybe he gets motivated certain times by the crowd or by having an enemy or a rival. But it seemed like he was just able to problem solve and play incredible defense and be patient and frustrate Alcaraz. And it seemed like that's where his focus was, rather than on some of the drama that it sometimes is. So that was what I noticed in that semifinal match. And I think, going into a final, especially after you've had a big win, especially after you've played a performance that you consider to be 12 out of 10, where you're at your very best, it's common that there can be some bit of a letdown, especially when you're playing Novak, and especially when he's motivated the way that he was, especially from both 2021, where he lost, didn't play his best against Medvedev, and 2022, where he wasn't able to play. I think with both of those, he was clearly up against a highly motivated opponent. And were there certain moments of vulnerability for Djokovic? Yes, I think definitely in that second set. But I think Medvedev would have had to bring out that 12 out of 12 or 12 out of 10 level again. And he was, I don't think he played poorly, but I think he was just short of that ultimately. And I think, I think there's, different things that he can take away and learn. And I think, he can start to think of, instead of it just being about Djokovic and Alcaraz, maybe it is more of a big three. And, he's now been to 5 finals, and he's won one of them. So I think he has certainly more of a claim than, many of the other top 5, top 10 players. But I think it's, I think if viewed in the right way, he can take a lot of that out of this performance as well. I mean, I think in certain ways in that final, and I think he talked about this, he could have tried to adjust more, maybe switch things up. I think, he didn't necessarily switch up the tactics in terms of his return position, in terms of coming up to net. I think he, didn't necessarily put pressure on Djokovic by coming up to net in the same way. I saw a stat from Craig O'Shaughnessy, where I think Djokovic was like 20 for 22 in serve and volley points, and Medvedev was 0 for 0, meaning he didn't attempt any. And I also get that Medvedev is a great baseliner, can play, great defense and offense from there. He's not necessarily as comfortable at the net, but sometimes you have to be able to get out of your comfort zone to take the other guy out, to take your opponent out of their comfort zone. And it didn't seem like he was necessarily able or willing to adjust and to switch up his tactics in order to change something up to potentially change the outcome.
Yeah, I thought he actually did a decent job though during points of getting into net at times, and he did win the vast majority of his net points. Given Novak's return position, I don't know that certain volley is a great strategy anyway for him. But given Medvedev's serve position, even though you would never think of Djokovic as a serve volleyer, it was just such an obvious thing to do on that deuce side. And you're right. And Medvedev brought that up in the press conference, is that he was a little too stubborn about it. And he noted that, his return against Alcaraz was much better than it was against Djokovic. And he didn't really change it till the third set. And, the air had gone out of his game, I think, a little too much at that point. So because he brought that up a few times, his stubbornness hurt him in that final. But he did play a much better second set, and it was almost like he had Djokovic on the ropes. But Djokovic can be very difficult to knock out, and he really proved that. And it just seemed like one of those Djokovic sets, Josh, where he just hangs around and he hangs around, he hangs around. Now we're in a tiebreaker. Now it's like, really close. And then, boom, he wins the last couple points and it's over. And, it's almost very, very different type of player, but that's the kind of thing Pete Sampras used to do as well, is you get to a really close spot. He ends up winning those last couple points and you're kind of like, okay, what just happened? How did I lose that set? And Medvedev obviously had an opportunity to win the set. He had an open shot, passing shot down the line. He chose to go back. Djokovic stayed home, made the volley, and Djokovic, I thought, did a good job of staying home several times during that second set, probably because he was tired. And instead of covering the open court, and Medvedev was a little bit stubborn there, I would say, too. He just kept trying to go behind Djokovic, and Djokovic, because of maybe feeling tired, didn't move and just stayed. Or maybe that was part of the scouting report, that they knew that Daniil would go behind him more often than go for the open court. So I think Medvedev, it's great to see him playing like this. He's obviously a great hard court player. And like you said, I think, Josh, you're right. He's certainly a legit number 3, top big 3 kind of guy. He's of his generation, he's the only one really who believes and has played with Novak and has beaten him. The others are not really able to do that on a consistent basis. So let's hope that he continues to get better, because he's fun to watch, I think. Just the way he moves around the court. And I like your point about how with Alcaraz, he's a little bit more focused on the tennis. I think there was one point where maybe he got a bit upset about some cheering during a serve, but that was the only time that he really engaged with the crowd in a not so positive way. But other than that, I think you're right. He was right on point. He knew he had to play well, and I think he felt like he was playing well. And when you feel that, it's easier to let stuff go than it is when you're not, right? When you're not playing well, it's easier to kind of look for excuses about things. And I think he did a really good job of that.
Absolutely. And I think you're bringing up a good point, that when you feel like things are going well, things are going smoothly, it's easier to focus on the tennis in those moments. You're not going to start looking for excuses. You're not going to start looking for distractions. You're not going to necessarily try to change up the dynamics of the match in that moment. So no, I think I think it's a great performance for him, and it'll be interesting to see what he could do at the end of this year and also going into next year. I mean, I think he obviously had a great performance at the 2021 US Open, winning it, and then 2022 was not his best year. And I think his ranking dropped out of the top 10. He had a much better year this year though, and brought his ranking all the way back up. And after this performance as well, and I think he's going to be coming into the end of this year and next year going in with a lot of confidence. So
Yeah,
that'll
and even
be
in 2022, overall not his best year, but it started off well because he got to the Australian Open final. Yeah, he did
yep.
lose a 2-set lead, and I think he actually had a few good hardcore tournaments before things went off. But I think it'd be exciting to see what he can do in Australia, this next time around, right? So,
Absolutely.
how about we talk about Coco and Novak and what helped them to be so successful here?
Sounds great. Sounds great. Should we start with Coco?
Sure.
So yeah, I think there's certainly a lot here. I mean, from the comeback to recent changes on her team, including bringing in Brad Gilbert, to what she said after the match. So I think there's a number of different things that we can look at here. I think bringing in Brad Gilbert, and I may be partial to this because we've talked a lot about him in the past here, and we've talked about his book, Winning Ugly. But I think bringing in somebody like that, I think what Brad really understands is how to find a way, how to figure things out, how to win a match, and how to win ugly, how to get the job done, and find a way ultimately. And that's really what she did in that final. She found a way. It wasn't pretty in the first set for her. Lost that first set 6-2, but managed to win that second set. It was a battle, and then was clearly ahead in that third. And I think maybe if we wanted to start with Brad Gilbert, I think it's interesting. There's I think been a lot of comments in the last couple of years about Coco's forehand. People look at other parts of her game, for instance, her serve and her speed and defense and her backhand, and they're sort of, their textbook. They're sort of what people would think of in terms of form, and then they're pretty clear strengths: her serve, her speed, her defense, and her backhand. But her forehand, I think, and I'm pretty sure she uses a more extreme grip, like a more extreme Western grip, and it's been to some extent a weakness for her. And it was interesting when Brad Gilbert came in. There was a lot of talk about, are we gonna, are you gonna change the grip, or are we gonna make major changes to the forehand? And he said, no, not right now, not before the U.S. Open. We're gonna sort of stick with it, and she can make it. She can play with that forehand that she has, and without making any changes, without focusing so much on the technique, you see the result. She was able to make it work and win the US Open. So I think that's an interesting point to maybe start with, that it wasn't necessarily so much of a focus on technique or the need to change her technique that brought her over the finish line and ultimately led her to her first major title.
Yeah, and I think what Brad's saying is the forehand's good enough. Now, to be fair, in the against Mahova really went after it, and that was successful to a certain degree. But Coco got through that match, and Sabalenka, I don't think really targeted it in the same way. I think Sabalenka just kind of did what she does, which is hit a lot of hard shots to open court, or a lot of hard shots cross court, wherever. So I think that's a good point. I think the other thing that Brad brings, and let's be honest, Brad is not necessarily the kind of coach who's going to connect with every single player. He's a very strong personality. He talks a lot of high energy. So I think it's a good example of, this is a good match. And I think what Coco had mentioned that Brad has brought to the team that maybe she needed more of was that fun and enjoyment factor. And we can't forget that this is, tennis it's a really hard job. It's a lot of grind, a lot of, tedious training, and you can get caught up in that. And you can get, it can be kind of miserable if you want it to be, because there's a lot of repetition going on. And, to be truly competitive person, you have to enjoy and love the sport. And that's something that I think kind of Brad oozes through his pores, is this joy for the game and joy for learning how to figure things out, how to win, and this really positive energy. And I think that really connected between the two of them. And so I think that was to me, that's a really important ingredient in Coco's development, is that she seems to really be enjoying that and connecting with her team in a really positive way. And so that's what I really liked about Brad's introduction to the team, is he brought that extra element that perhaps wasn't there, because for various reasons before.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think whether people are listening to his commentary or reading his tweets, or listening to the nicknames that he has for players, you can sense that passion. So I absolutely agree. And I think it sort of is that mindset of, let's figure things out. Let's be a problem solver. Let's, we don't have to stick with what's not working. We can find a way. We can find a way with, with your forehand as it is right now. It's good enough. Yeah, no, I think that, and I know he's not her main coach. I think it's Pere Riba. But yeah, I think his influence as sort of a consultant, or as sort of that extra layer of support seemed to make a difference there. One thing that I think stood out to me, and I think maybe stood out to some other people, was in her post-match, I guess, yeah, her post-match interview on the court, where she was giving her speech on the court, and she was talking about being, sort of being fueled by some of the doubters, or some of the doubts around her and around her performance. And I thought that was interesting, because, I don't think necessarily everyone can do this, but I think for some people, they're able to take, doubts. They're able to take maybe naysayers, or people that say that they can't do it, or, oh, Coco's never going to win a major. And they're able to use that as motivation. And again, we talked a little bit about the motivation of Sabalenka, going forward for the rest of the year. But it seemed like she was, she thanked the people that told her that she couldn't do it, and seemed to really use that as motivation. And she even talked about in her post-match press conference that even right before the match, even I think 10 minutes before the match, she was looking at some of the comments that people were making, which was interesting, which is probably not something I would recommend a
Yeah,
player
I don't think
do.
so either.
Yeah, she said, so I really told myself, literally up until like 10 minutes before the match, I was just reading comments of people saying I wasn't going to win today. And she was laughing as she was saying that. And then she said, that just put the fire in me. So it's a unique strategy, certainly. Again, not something I would probably recommend for everybody to do. I think, and we could probably devote an episode or a series of episodes about social media. But I think I think there's certainly, plenty of cases, and probably most cases, where people spending time on social media, people listening to everything that people have to say about them, probably doesn't help, and probably puts them in a more negative state of mind. But for her, it seemed to motivate her. And I think she was, I think part of it is probably she felt ready. Maybe, in that French Open final last year, she wasn't quite ready,
Yeah.
when she played Iga. But no, maybe part of it was that she felt she was ready. She had that self-belief, and then she sort of used those comments from others as that extra bit of motivation, that extra bit of sort of fuel for her fire to push her over the edge. And maybe she thought back to that in some of those key moments in that second and third set. So, kudos to her to getting over the finish line there. And I Yeah, I think there will certainly be a lot more to come from her. And I know it's been, ever since she was what, 14 or 15, something like that, where she sort of started to have this breakthrough. And I think there's been a lot of expectations on her throughout the years, which can be a lot of pressure. But I think her winning her first Grand Slam will take a lot of that pressure off, and now she can just focus on her game and doing her thing, and maybe doesn't have to listen to all the comments and all the critics and look at all the social media posts and what people are saying, and maybe she can focus just on her game, or maybe she continues to do that and maybe that's what motivates and motivates her and inspires her.
Yeah, some athletes do like the kind of like I'll show you type of attitude, where others might take some of those comments more to heart and feel bad or let them creep in and create doubt and so forth. And obviously she's the type who can look at that and say, yeah, I'll show you, kind of play the, you're not respecting me. I'm going to go out there and prove that I'm better than you think I am, and I think it's great that she's able to do that. Like you said, Josh, that's probably not a strategy we would promote to everybody, but if you know yourself and you're able to do that. I know some players that I play with or compete with that are great at that. And some of them, whether they even know it or not, are almost like looking at the environment and looking for somebody to disrespect them, and then it gets them going. And then they've got a lot of energy for that match. So yeah, I think that's one of those sort of self-awareness type of things. The whole, looking at social media before, you were telling me kind of the story of what Djokovic was doing with his team, kind of the opposite, right?
Yes, yes. So he took a different approach, and I think Djokovic seemed to think back to a couple years ago where he lost to Medvedev, where he was going for the calendar Grand Slam of winning all four majors the same year. And here's a quote from him from his post-match press conference, where which I thought was very interesting, just hearing about how he tried to navigate this moment and sort of the expectations and the thoughts about this moment, but also manage some of the people around him in his environment. So here's his quote. I wouldn't say probably that it was easy. Easier comparing to what exactly we don't know, because I don't think too many players were in that position. Yeah, I guess people have comeback stories. I love them too. They motivate me. Obviously, different circumstances, Australia and here. I haven't played any tournament on American soil for 2 years, and the last time I was here, I lost in the finals against the same player I beat today. You know, I really did my best in the last 48 hours not to allow the importance of the moment and what's on the line to get in my head, because 2 years ago, that's what happened. So it's interesting, first of all, that he's saying that. And then he says, and I underperformed and I wasn't able to be at my best and I was outplayed. So I learned my lesson. My team, my family knew the last 24 hours, don't touch me, don't speak to me about, the history of what's on the line. I really did my best to keep things quite simple and stick to the routines that brought me to where I am and treat this match really as any other match where I just need to win. But of course, lots of different thoughts going through my head. What if scenarios, images that you have in your mind of, what it will look like if you win and also if you lose, so I'm trying to block those ones. So it's interesting him talking about, both thinking about what happened 2 years ago, and and also thinking about the circumstances that and really with him now, he was at 23 majors, now he's at 24. To get from 22 to 20, to get from 21 to 22, he tied Nadal's men's Grand Slam record. To get from 22 to 23, he broke Nadal's Grand Slam record, tying Serena. Now getting from 23 to 24, he's passing Serena, tying Margaret Court. So it's pretty much at every step right now. Every time he wins a major, he's breaking history. But he's talking about how instead of trying to focus on that, instead of him thinking about both the history and what happened 2 years ago, or letting the people around him talk about it, bring that up to him, he's really focused on managing both his own mindset and that environment around him. And then he's also talking about, while he's out there, he's having some of these thoughts. Is what if this happens? What if that happens? Both positive and negative. What if I win? And what if I lose? Right. And I think these are thoughts that every tennis player has. Thinking about what does this mean for my ranking? What are people going to say? All of these sorts of things. So I think it's important for all tennis players to recognize that, these are thoughts that, number one, people that you're playing with are having, but number two, the best players in the world have similar sorts of thoughts. But I thought it was a really interesting approach, and I think an approach that worked for him. Again, as you said, Brian, a different approach than Coco took, but I think an approach that he used really effectively.
And again, self-awareness. He knew what he needed, and that was the thing I was most impressed about, was managing the environment around him. Like, everybody knows what not to talk about, and it let him then focus on the good routines and habits that he has. And I think that's really important, is that you get back to doing what you do and simply letting that help you to make sure that your performance is where you want it to be. Very often distractions can take us out of our good habits and good systems. And so he was just trying to simplify everything. Let me just continue to do everything that I do. Just focus on that. And if I do those things well, then I obviously give myself an excellent chance of winning. I thought another theme that the two shared was this idea of being persistent, being resilient. Obviously, Coco having to come back from a first set loss, and really Novak having to deal with Medvedev playing very well in that second set, some really long points. I think Novak was definitely feeling it a bit, physically in that second set, but yet he never gave in, and he managed to just to be persistent and resilient enough to pull out that second set. And once he did that, I think the match was pretty much in his favor, and he really couldn't see Medvedev coming back. So I think just an impressive way for Novak, based on his experience. Again, knowing himself, what he needed, he managed that environment around him, and he did the things he needed to do. He was able to stay focused on those positive habits. And of course, when you do that, you're able to manage those other thoughts better, accept them, be able to dismiss them more. And so he's got so much experience in that. So, great accomplishment for him. He's now got 24 major titles. No reason to see him stopping at this point. And it'd be very interesting to see what happens with the rest of the year and into the Australian Open.
Definitely. And he spoke about that motivation piece as well. Him being 36, competing with 20-year-olds, and talked about that motivation piece. He brought up, certain champions from other sports, whether it's LeBron James or Tom Brady, and how they, they continued to raise the bar at later ages. And that seems to really, push him and motivate him. As does, it seems that the sort of title count seems to motivate him and push him as well. So I thought that was interesting, and didn't necessarily hear the motivation piece from Medvedev, but just from the press conferences of Sabalenka, Coco, and Djokovic in three very different ways, hearing that motivation piece and how they, both all seem to be pretty clear about some of the factors that motivate them, whether that's Coco with, some of the doubters, whether that's Sabalenka thinking about the rest of the season and sort of holding on to, her number one ranking, or whether that's Djokovic thinking about, continuing to make more and more history, and to, do maybe what's never been done in terms of being this successful at this age and this stage in his career.
And I think it's great for everybody to think about, what are some of the things that really drive me? What are some of the things that have been the positive motivators in the past? And positive doesn't have to mean positive emotions. It could be something like proving something to someone else. But the more that you explore that for yourself and understand it, then the more intentional you can be around that. The more you can manage your own environment as you begin to compete, rather than letting just sort of the circumstances of the day drive, performance. I think that's always the thing we're looking to do, Josh, is the more self-awareness we have, the more we can be intentional about how we use motivation, use other mental skills to create that perfect environment for us. So, well, that's our show for today. Thank you for listening to our 2023 US Open recap. For more on today's episode, please check out the show notes. If you have any feedback for the two of us, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. Also, if you are enjoying the content that Josh and I discuss on the show, please rate and review the podcast so other tennis enthusiasts can find it more easily. Additionally, to be notified of new episodes, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube. You can also check us out on Instagram. If you would like to support the podcast, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership, where you can learn about the benefits of being part of the Tennis IQ podcast community. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.